They used to call it the city that never surrendered, a place built from iron, intellect, and unbroken will. Yet behind the glass towers and shimmering lights of Novogorod, a quiet truth was beginning to rot the myth. The same city that gave birth to a ruler promising eternal strength had become the first to show his weakness. For decades, Novogorod was not merely a city, it was a statement. It stood at the edge of the Northern Sea, forged in cold winds and harder history, where every street carried the echo of wars once survived and promises once believed. It was here that Viktor Morozov, the man who would shape the modern empire, was born. From its factories came steel, and from its schools came minds that built missiles, engines, and ideologies.
Yes, but it
the
arrived.
city was both cradle and
thankful
cathedral,
for the stability.
the origin of his power and the symbol of his order. But over time, the rhythm of Novogorod changed. The pulse of factories that once hummed with progress now pounded for war. The port that once sent out ships of commerce now loaded cargoes of ammunition, and through the heart of it all ran a single steel artery, the Northern Rail Corridor, a 280-kilometer stretch of track that carried the empire's breath to the front lines. Trains full of soldiers, tanks, and fuel crossed it daily like blood through veins. If that line ever stopped, the body it sustained would suffocate. People had learned to live with its sound, the thunder of steel on steel that lulled the nights of Novogorod. For them, it was the sound of stability. For the regime, it was the sound of control. But every system built on fear forgets that silence is deadlier than noise. Beneath the city's pride, the machinery of truth had rusted. Engineers who once built locomotives now watched them leave with dread, knowing each train carried more lives than it could ever return. Workers kept their heads down, soldiers saluted the horizon, and citizens whispered the same words in secret: "We are safe because we are unseen." That illusion held, day after day, rail after rail, until one October evening, when safety itself began to unravel. In those days, Viktor Morozov ruled not just through laws, but through memory. He invoked the legacy of old wars, the triumphs of ancestors, the sacred idea that his city was untouchable. But empires collapse not from the outside, they rot from the roots of their own arrogance. The empire forgot that even steel fatigues, even loyalty cracks under the weight of lies. The Northern Corridor had always been more than a railway. It was a mirror of everything Novogorod believed itself to be: efficient, disciplined, and unbreakable. The ports at the Baltic end shipped engines, cannons, and armored vehicles built in the city's colossal plants. From there, the trains rolled through forests and frost, heading south toward the Ukrainian front and west toward the shadow of NATO. Every bolt, every rail joint, every bridge had been counted, guarded, catalogued. Yet no one noticed how vulnerable faith can be when it travels in straight lines. When the citizens of Novogorod spoke of war, they spoke as if it lived far away. They said the fighting was distant, the danger was elsewhere. The soldiers were nameless men in nameless lands. They forgot that every train that left their city carried a fragment of themselves, their labor, their taxes, their silence. The city's peace was not peace at all. It was a temporary blindness, bought with obedience. History, however, has a way of demanding sight. Somewhere deep inside that endless network of steel and power, something invisible had begun to move. It was not an army, it was not a sound. It was simply awareness, the kind that spreads quietly, like a whisper through metal, like a thought through a mind that has suddenly learned to question.
The map
And for the
shows a
first
weakness
time
here,
in years,
near the old sector.
rhythm of
We
Novogord's
move
machinery
tonight.
seemed
I understand.
uncertain.
We will
Those
be
who
ready.
lived there didn't know it yet. But the city that once symbolized strength was about to face its own reflection. The fortress that had defied the world was now being tested not by enemies across borders, but by the truths it had buried beneath its own foundations. Far from the noise of battlefields, a new kind of war was being written, one made not of bombs or armies, but of the invisible fracture between control and conscience. And as the trains thundered one last time through the cold northern night, few realized that history had already changed tracks. It began with a sound no one was supposed to hear, a single, fractured roar that split the night, like the breaking of a promise. In that moment, the city of Novogorod lost more than a railway. It lost the illusion that it could control its own heartbeat. On the night of October 20, the northern corridor, the proud artery that carried the Empire's strength to the front, fell silent. A train heavy with weapons, fuel, and steel erupted into a column of flame. The air shook, the ground trembled, and within seconds, the hum of the nation's northern machine collapsed into stillness. The explosion wasn't merely an attack on infrastructure. It was a message written in fire, addressed to the very core of power. For decades, the state had spoken to its people through parades and propaganda, telling them that the homeland was invincible, that no force could reach its industrial heart. But on that night, the truth arrived, not as a speech, but as silence. When dawn came, the great supply line that once connected Novogorod to the southern front no longer existed. Steel rails were twisted into ribbons. Dozens of freight cars lay shattered, their cargo scattered like the pieces of a broken oath. Communication channels went dark, and the orders from command centers turned to confusion. What had been the Empire's most reliable lifeline had become its most fragile wound. For years, trains from Novogorod had carried the lifeblood of war tanks, forged in the city's factories, engines built in its foundries, ammunition stamped with its emblem. They had crossed this 280-kilometer corridor day and night, feeding the conflict far away. But now, everything stopped. The production lines still roared, but their work had nowhere to go. The warehouses filled, the ports backed up, and the Empire's mighty logistics system suffocated under its own momentum. Officials called it a temporary setback. Analysts called it sabotage. But for those who understood what the Northern Corridor meant, it was something much deeper, a rupture in the Empire's nervous system. Without this artery, the northern military districts could no longer breathe. The factories of Novogorod had long been the Empire's furnace, built to turn raw steel into weapons and soldiers into symbols. The men and women who worked there were told they were part of history, guardians of strength, heirs of sacrifice.
Communications are down across the entire
but as
sector.
the days
What is the
passed
status of the
and the
supply
trains
routes?
stopped
Severed,
coming,
Colonel. We have no
pride
confirmed
turned
visual.
into unease.
Find me a bypass.
The air no longer carried the rhythm of departure. It carried the weight of something ending. For the first time, the silence became louder than the machines. Inside the command offices, officials traced maps, recalculated routes, and demanded explanations. But no formula could fix the fact that the Empire's greatest strength had always depended on one fragile line of steel. Every kilometer of that track had been built on the assumption that nothing could go wrong. And yet, in a single night, everything did. To the people of Novogorod, it felt as if the pulse of their city had stopped mid-beat. The trains had always been the proof that life was moving, a reassurance that order still existed. But when the freight cars vanished from the horizon, a strange emptiness took their place.
The northern corridor is critical.
It wasn't fear of the enemy that
Army?
unsettled them.
Comms are down, sir.
It was the realization that the
rerouting
system they trusted could crumble from within. The newspapers printed cautious words. They spoke of technical malfunctions, of repairs underway, of resilience and unity. But behind those words lay panic. Those who worked closest to the network knew how catastrophic this was. Without that corridor, Novogorod's industry was no longer a weapon. It was a prison of its own creation. Tanks rusted in warehouses, ammunition
The secondary
stockpiled in
explosions are
forgotten
increasing.
yards. The Empire's strength was now stranded within its own
rail
borders,
corridor is severed
and in
at the
that
main
stillness, something
know how they
profound
bypassed
began
the
to
grid.
take shape.
We are
The people who
cross-referencing
once
the
believed
satellite
the
data
war
now,
was
sir.
far away could now feel it under their own skin. The explosion might have taken place miles from the city's center, but its echo reached every corner of life. It rang in the factories, in the ports, in the government halls, in the quiet spaces where families whispered of things they were not supposed to say. The silence that followed became its own kind of thunder. It traveled faster than any news bulletin,
Secure the
heavier than
perimeter
any weapon.
immediately.
It said
I want
what
this
no
sector cleared by
propaganda could
sunrise.
undo.
Move out!
That power built on distance cannot survive when the front line moves home. The Empire had always promised that the heart of Novogorod would never stop beating. But that night, when the corridor fell, the heart skipped a beat, and the world learned that even the strongest empires can die of a single moment of silence. They were called the Iron Division soldiers who believed they could not be broken. But in the days after the explosion, the most powerful airborne unit in the north discovered a truth that no bullet had ever taught them. Sometimes defeat arrives not from the enemy's fire, but from the silence of an empty rail. The 76th Paratrooper Division, once the symbol of national pride, stood stranded at its southern garrison, cut off, undersupplied, and uncertain. These were men trained to fall from the sky, to strike with precision, to crush resistance before it could breathe. They had stormed cities, silenced rebellions, and marched through foreign lands with the confidence of those who believed destiny itself wore their insignia. Now they waited, and waiting was the one thing they had never been trained to do. For years, the Iron Division had lived as the chosen sword of the Empire. They were the first to enter Crimea, the shadow behind Chechnya, the unseen hand in Bucha and Irpin, the places where history blurred into silence. They were the men who moved before orders were spoken, the ones who carried the myth of invincibility on their shoulders. Yet when the northern corridor was cut, the myth turned against them. Their power, built on speed and precision, was nothing without the trains that fed their wings. The lifeline from Novogorod had always been their unseen ally. Every weapon, every bullet, every ration of fuel came from that northern artery. It was the invisible pulse that kept their machines alive and their momentum unstoppable. But now, that pulse was gone. The factories still roared, the commanders still demanded, but nothing reached the field. The Iron Division, the Empire's
Report the
pride,
status
had
of the
been left
Mirovskaya
suspended
line
in the
anomaly.
void between glory and hunger. Inside their bases, time began to change shape. Days no longer measured by missions, but by what did not arrive. Crates that once came like clockwork never appeared. Helicopters grounded for lack of parts. Vehicles lined up, waiting for repairs that would never come. The silence of the railways had turned into a kind of paralysis, and in that stillness, the soldiers began to feel the weight of something they had never known before: doubt. To the generals in Novogorod, it was a logistical inconvenience. To the men in the field, it was a quiet apocalypse. The orders kept coming, but the means to execute them vanished. They were the guardians of the western frontier, positioned just a few dozen kilometers from the NATO border, a line that defined not just geography, but pride. They had been told that if war ever came, they would be the first to strike. But now they couldn't even move. The Empire's iron fist had turned to stone. The soldiers remembered the promises that their homeland would never abandon them, that their cause was righteous, that their strength was eternal. But the silence from the north spoke louder than all those words. When supply convoys stopped, when ammunition dwindled, when the power generators ran low, faith began to fracture. Not in rebellion, but in realization. They were no longer fighting for dominance. They were fighting against time. The men who once carried the weight of conquest now carried the weight of waiting. Each day stretched into the next, and each night became a reminder that loyalty alone could not fill an empty tank or reload an empty rifle. They began to understand that the Empire's greatest illusion had been its own efficiency, a machine so vast it forgot the fragility of its smallest part. One railway, one explosion, and the entire system began to unravel. Still, they endured. The Iron Division was built to obey, not to question. Yet beneath their discipline, something unspoken began to take root. They had seen how quickly heroes became tools, and tools became expendable. They had seen cities fall, civilians vanish, promises rewritten. And now they saw what happens when the hand that commands them trembles. The fall of the northern corridor was not just the collapse of a route, it was the exposure of a truth long hidden beneath medals and slogans. Power was never in the muscle of the soldier, nor in the metal of his weapon. It had always been in the lifeline that connected him to the world he served. When that lifeline was cut, even the strongest division became a monument to stillness. In the barracks, the insignias still gleamed, the flags still hung, the orders still echoed through the corridors. But everyone knew something had shifted. The Empire's sharpest blade was rusting in its own sheath, and for the first time in their lives, the men of the Iron Division began to understand that strength without movement is only a memory of power. It began as a whisper on October 7, a small explosion, a moment too brief to change history. Yet, within that fleeting instant, the first crack appeared in the Empire's illusion of control. What seemed like a technical fault on the Mirovskaya line would soon reveal itself as the rehearsal for a catastrophe. The first blast came and went with little notice. A minor derailment, they said. A glitch in the system,
It's a full
damaged
coordinated
signal
assault on
box,
the western
a
frontier.
delay easily
Alert all
explained.
commands.
The
We are taking
officials
heavy
spoke with the
losses.
calmness of men who believed their fortress
Iron
was
Division,
unshakable.
we have confirmed hostile
But beneath
presence on the
their
western
rehearsed
frontier.
composure,
You are
the
authorized to
truth
engage
was already
immediately.
moving
We are
quiet,
counting on you, soldier.
invisible,
Good luck.
inevitable.
We're losing the
The
perimeter.
northern
All
corridor,
units,
the
fall
most
back to the
guarded
secondary
artery of the
line.
Empire, had been
Sir,
touched by an unseen
casualty
hand.
numbers are rising too
Those who
fast.
investigated the wreckage found nothing conclusive. No foreign agents, no open sabotage, no fingerprints left behind. But the message was there, carved not in words, but in precision. Whoever had placed the explosives had known everything: the timing of the train, the weight of its cargo, the blind spots of the patrols. It wasn't a random act. It was a warning. A line
I told
drawn
you it
in
was
silence
useless to even
across
look
the
at it
Empire's
today.
pride.
We have to try.
Inside the
Can't just leave it
security
sitting here. We are
chambers of
missing critical
Novigard,
components.
the
There is
generals
nothing we can
dismissed
do.
it as coincidence. They told themselves the system was too vast to fail, too disciplined to be breached. They relied on numbers, on protocols, on the comfort of hierarchy. They forgot that systems are only as strong as the men who believe in them, and belief, like steel, can fracture. The explosion on the Mirovskaya line was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a test shot, a quiet rehearsal for something far greater. It proved that the Empire's heartbeat could be interrupted. It showed that the invulnerable could be touched. In the silence that followed, a shadow began to move across the maps of the North, tracing every rail, every junction, every bridge that carried the weight of the nation's war. For decades, the Empire's confidence had been built on routine. The trains left Novigard at dawn, arrived in Pskov by night, refueled, and continued south. The rhythm never broke. It was as predictable as breath. But when that rhythm faltered, even for a moment, it carried the weight of prophecy. Because once silence enters a system built on repetition, it never truly leaves. In the days after October 7, small
They've
changes
cut off the
appeared.
supply lines here
Security
and here.
was tightened,
Until we
patrols
clear this
doubled,
route, we are
orders
blind.
rewritten. Yet each new measure only revealed the fear behind it. Every soldier guarding a bridge now wondered if the next explosion would be beneath his feet. Every engineer inspecting the rails began to see the line not as a lifeline, but as a target. Trust eroded quietly, not because of what had happened, but because of what could. For the unseen planners behind the attack, it was proof of concept. They had touched the Empire's most sensitive nerve and lived to see the panic it caused. They had shown that a single hand, placed precisely, could paralyze a system of thousands. They needed no victory parade, no public claim of success. The silence that followed was victory enough. Meanwhile, within the high offices of the Security Bureau, reports piled up. Each one ended with the same word: contained. But
Wait, what about
containment
the
was a
line? Get
lie,
moving!
whispered to those too afraid to face the scale of what was coming. The Empire believed it had learned its lesson. It had not. It believed it had restored control. It hadn't. It believed its enemies were still at the borders. They were already inside. The small explosion on the Mirovskaya line should have sounded every alarm. Instead, it was buried under reports and ceremonies, its echoes drowned by speeches about resilience and strength. Yet history rarely announces itself with fanfare. It begins with something small, a spark, a whisper, a missed warning, and grows until it consumes the silence that ignored it. The men who cleaned the wreckage that day didn't know they were standing at the edge of the storm. The officers who signed the reports didn't realize they were signing away their future. The city that slept under the illusion of safety didn't feel the tremor beneath its feet. But every empire ends the same way, not with a bang too loud to miss, but with a warning too quiet to hear. 13 days later, that whisper would return as fire. But on October 7, it was still just an echo small enough to dismiss, precise enough to terrify, and real enough to prove that even the greatest fortress begins to fall from within. It was no accident, no act of chance, no wild rebellion. The explosion that silenced the Northern Corridor on October 20 was the result of minds that had studied precision the way others study prayer. It was the work of people who no longer believed in shouting, but in silence, sharp enough to cut through steel. Behind the fire and smoke, there was design, a pattern drawn by hands that knew every timetable, every patrol rotation, every blind camera on the line. The Empire called it sabotage. Those who understood it called it calculation. For this was not the fury of chaos, it was the discipline of purpose. The strike that burned through the heart of the Northern Rail was planned not by armies, but by individuals who had lived too long under the weight of obedience and finally learned that precision could be more powerful than rage. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were the forgotten engineers, technicians, mechanics, people whose lives had been spent maintaining the machine that oppressed them. They had built the rails, oiled the gears, and repaired the carriages that carried death to the front. They knew every sound of the city's machinery, every hum of its lifeline. They also knew how easily those sounds could stop. It was this quiet knowledge that became their weapon. To destroy an empire, they didn't need to conquer its borders, only to understand its rhythm. And the Northern Corridor was the rhythm of Novigard. When that rhythm broke, everything the regime relied upon began to stumble. The placement of explosives on that October night was not random. It was surgical. The device detonated beneath a freight car carrying fuel and munitions, amplifying the blast far beyond its size. A single strike created a chain reaction that ripped through the convoy, consuming everything in fire. But the true brilliance of the act wasn't the explosion itself, it was the timing. It struck at the moment when the Empire's guards were changing shifts, when the line was least monitored, when confusion would spread faster than rescue. The Empire's greatest vulnerability was not its infrastructure, but its arrogance. It believed control was permanent, that loyalty was absolute, that fear was enough to keep everything in line. But fear, like pressure in a sealed chamber, builds until it finds a fracture. The men and women who carried out the operation had been shaped by the same system they now undermined. They had listened to the same speeches, recited the same oaths, stood under the same flag. What changed wasn't their skill, it was their silence. They turned the Empire's own precision against itself. When the fire consumed the freight cars, it wasn't only cargo that burned, it was illusion. The illusion that loyalty could be measured, that control could be absolute, that technology could exist without conscience. The explosion was not the scream of rebellion, it was the exhale of inevitability. The scale of their success astonished even them. The detonation not only tore through the line but ignited the ammunition within the convoy, creating a second inferno that burned long enough to halt traffic for days. Communication along the route collapsed. The system that prided itself on redundancy discovered it had none. In one night, the lifeline that supplied the Empire's western divisions was severed beyond quick repair. The investigators who arrived in the aftermath found no trace of the perpetrators, no digital trail, no intercepted message, no surveillance footage, only fragments of steel, scorched earth, and the undeniable proof that someone inside had known too much. The state's greatest fear was not the explosion itself, but the possibility that its own citizens had learned to think independently. Because an enemy at the border can be fought, but an idea that grows inside cannot be killed. As the Security Bureau scrambled to explain the unexplainable, the whispers spread faster than any announcement could contain. Some said it was foreign agents, others swore it was a resistance network. But those who lived near the railway, the workers, the families, the ones who smelled the burning fuel, they understood something different. They knew it wasn't outsiders who had done this. It was one of their own, someone who had seen too much to stay silent and too little hope to wait for change. That was the real brilliance of the act. It wasn't meant to claim glory or recognition. It was meant to remind the people that even in the most controlled society, someone still remembered how to act without permission. The explosion was not the beginning of a revolution. It was proof that one could still exist. The Empire would call it terrorism, The world would call it defiance. But for those who had lived their entire lives under the weight of lies, it was something else entirely. A heartbeat returning to a body that had long been declared dead. And for one brief night, as the flames lit the northern sky, Novigard remembered what it meant to be alive. The Empire's first instinct was not to investigate it, was to disconnect. Within minutes of the explosion, mobile networks went dark, internet lines were cut, and digital silence fell across the region like a second explosion. The government's greatest weapon had never been its soldiers or missiles. It was its ability to control what people knew, and on that night, fear of the truth proved stronger than fear of the enemy. In every generation of power, there comes a moment when leaders stop defending their people and start defending their image. For Viktor Morozov's regime, that moment arrived the second the flames from the northern corridor began to rise. The Security Bureau rushed not to the wreckage, but to the control rooms of communication towers, pulling switches, cutting signals, and silencing the flow of information. To them, victory was not measured in safety but in secrecy. Inside apartments across Novigard, phones stopped working. Social feeds froze mid-sentence. Families trying to call loved ones near the railway heard only static. The blackouts spread faster than the news itself. People didn't know what had happened, only that the state didn't want them to know, and in a nation trained to obey, that silence spoke louder than any siren. The panic censorship was instinctive, almost ancient, the same reflex that once buried disasters under propaganda and replaced pain with parades. It was the continuation of an old doctrine. If reality cannot be controlled, hide it. If truth becomes dangerous, erase it. But what the regime didn't understand was that silence no longer meant ignorance. In the modern world, silence meant confirmation. The people knew that if the government went dark, something unthinkable had occurred. Through the blackout, rumors began to breathe. Whispered stories traveled through factory halls and crowded buses. A train full of ammunition destroyed, soldiers missing, the Western line severed. The government called it a minor incident. But the citizens of Novigard could feel the shift, a tremor not beneath the ground, but beneath belief itself. For the first time in decades, the Empire's northern heart felt vulnerable. To the leadership, the blackout was a strategy of containment. To the people, it was a confession. When the screens went black, when the official channels spoke only in denial, they saw the truth for what it was. The regime that promised protection was now afraid of its own citizens. The moment a state begins to fear its people more than its enemies, the foundation beneath it begins to crack. The following day, the silence deepened. Newspapers printed identical statements written by the same invisible hand. Television anchors smiled too much, spoke too little. Officials praised the government's swift response, though no one could explain what had been done. The Empire's message was clear: obedience first, questions later. But the people's eyes had changed. Once opened, they could not close again. In the military compounds near Pskov, soldiers waited for orders that never came. In the factories of Novigard, workers stared at idle machines, aware that production meant nothing if no train could carry their labor. And in the quiet apartments of the city, families gathered around dead screens, listening not for news, but for the echo of something breaking the sound of faith, leaving the room. The blackout, meant to suppress panic, achieved the opposite. It unified silence into suspicion, and suspicion into awareness. People began to realize that if the state could hide one disaster, it could hide many. The old contract obedience in exchange for security was now void. The regime had drawn its greatest weapon, and it had backfired. Within the walls of the Security Bureau, confusion hardened into fear. Officials argued over whether the attack had been external or internal, but none dared speak the real question. How had the enemy crossed into the Empire's most guarded territory without being seen? The fear that spread among them was not of another explosion, it was of exposure. They knew the people would not stay quiet forever. Morozov's advisors urged him to restore the network, to show strength through communication.
Officials are confirming that there is absolutely no major incident.
He remembered
Everything
the
is
lessons of
perfectly safe.
Chernobyl, the chaos of transparency, the danger of uncontrolled truth.
Did
To
you hear
him,
what happened on
cutting
the
the
night
internet
shift?
was not weakness, it was
They're
survival.
saying it wasn't an accident,
Yet every
Mikhail.
minute of silence was another confession broadcast in invisible waves. The blackout had become a mirror, reflecting not stability, but fragility. In the days that followed, Novogorod stood still. The government's slogans about unity rang hollow against the weight of doubt. The people began to sense what the leaders could not admit, that the empire's true collapse would not come from foreign bombs, but from within its own circuitry of lies. The blackout, meant to protect the regime, had become its self-inflicted wound. For the first time since its founding, the empire had turned its defense inward. The railways were silent, the networks dead, the truth forbidden, and somewhere between fear and realization, the citizens of Novogorod understood that the fire on the tracks was no longer just a military event. It was a symbol, a single spark that revealed how easily power can burn from the inside. The explosion on October 20 was not a beginning. It was the culmination of a chain that had started long before a sequence of warnings ignored, of patterns repeated, of lessons left unlearned. Those who studied the empire's slow unraveling would later trace it back to one word: complacency. The seeds of this collapse had been planted months earlier, in the borderlands of Bryansk and the northern skies above Solent Base, where silence had already proven deadlier than noise. In May 2023, a freight train carrying military cargo derailed in the forests of Bryansk. The next day, another was struck. 2 attacks in 24 hours. Officials dismissed them as isolated incidents, yet to those who paid attention,
Nonsense.
they were the opening
The
notes
schematic
of a song
exaggerates
that
the
would
damage.
crescendo into the chaos
We have
of
more pressing
Novogorod.
matters.
The partisans had tested the empire's logistics and found the weak points. 2 strikes were all it took to prove that Russia's vast rail network, once the pride of its engineers and the spine of its armies, was a soft target wrapped in hard denial. The empire's doctrine had always relied on rail. Steel and discipline, they said, would carry the war across distance. But what the Bryansk attacks revealed was something simpler. The larger a system grows, the easier it is to paralyze. A single blast, a single obstruction, and entire armies could be starved of motion. It was the first rehearsal for a strategy that would later cripple the North logistical strangulation. The partisans had not just blown up rails, they had blown up the myth of invulnerability. Then came the summer strike, August 2023. Solent Base, one of the Empire's most strategic military airfields, home to Tu-22M3 bombers, the war machines that carried fire over distant cities. The Empire believed this fortress was untouchable. Its radars were the most advanced, its guards the most loyal. And yet, one afternoon, a small drone no larger than a suitcase, no faster than a bicycle, slipped through the defense grid and struck a bomber on the runway. The explosion was surgical. The billion-dollar aircraft burned until it was unrecognizable. The Empire claimed minor damage.
This is pointless.
The photographs
We're completely
told a different
stuck.
story. That drone was not just a weapon. It was a revelation. It showed the world that the northern flank, the skies that guarded Novogorod, was blind. A toy of metal and wire had slipped through the armor of pride and left behind the ashes of certainty. For those who understood, Solent was not an isolated embarrassment. It was the first domino,
This report is
the one
irrelevant.
that proved
The
the
resources
Empire's
are finalized.
frontiers
But
were
the Bryansk
illusions
derailment
painted on the
requires
map.
immediate
Each of these
attention, sir.
attacks, Bryansk, Solent, Mirovskaya, formed a trilogy of failure. The enemy was not testing targets, it was testing the system. It was mapping how far it could go, how quickly it could strike, how slowly the Empire would react. And each time, the reaction was the same denial. Each incident became a classified footnote, hidden behind patriotic speeches and empty reassurances. But beneath the surface, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The Empire's own intelligence officers began to notice the rhythm. Every few months, a new strike appeared farther north, closer to the heart. It was as if an invisible hand was drawing a line across the country, moving upward, marking every weakness with precision. The map of sabotage looked less like chaos and more like design, a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose. And at the center of that noose was the city that once believed itself immortal, Novogorod. When the October 7 explosion hit the Mirovskaya line, the Empire should have understood what was coming. It was no longer a random act. It was the next step in a pattern that had already written itself in fire. Yet again, they looked away. Yet again, they chose pride over prevention. The Security Bureau spoke of increased patrols, of tightened surveillance, of new protocols, but they never realized that prevention means nothing when the enemy is already inside your walls. To those who orchestrated the strikes, it was all part of the same choreography: precision over force, patience over glory. They didn't need to invade. They needed only to wait until the Empire defeated itself. By October 2025, the rehearsal had become performance. What started in Bryansk as a test of endurance ended in Novogorod as a statement of mastery. Every empire believes its own propaganda until the first tremor of truth arrives. For Morozov's regime, that tremor came not from the outside, but from its own neglected corners, the forests, the airfields, the railways that once carried its power. Each attack was a mirror, reflecting what the government refused to see, that control without vision is blindness. When the flames rose over the northern corridor, they illuminated more than the wreckage of a train. They illuminated the path that had led there, a trail of arrogance, repetition, and silence. The Empire had been warned in May. It had been warned again in August. It had been warned once more in early October. Every warning had been disguised as coincidence. Every coincidence had been prophecy. And when prophecy arrived in fire, there was no one left to claim surprise. In the aftermath of the explosion, Novogorod was no longer a city, it was a question. Everything that had once defined it, the industry, the pride, the certainty, now stood in doubt. The northern corridor, once the Empire's unbreakable artery, had become its open wound. The trains no longer moved, the factories no longer mattered, and the silence that spread through the north was no longer the silence of control, it was the silence of reckoning. The destruction of the railway did not simply halt a supply line. It dismantled an entire belief system. For generations, the Empire had told its people that strength was eternal, that systems never failed, that order was forever. But when the rails twisted and the engines burned, those promises melted into the same smoke. What had been hidden behind slogans was finally visible, the fragile machinery that kept the Empire breathing. The first cracks appeared in the smallest places. Trucks began to replace trains, carrying crates of ammunition and fuel across roads never built for war. But the scale was impossible. A single train could carry what hundreds of trucks could not. The roads broke under the weight, the vehicles stalled, the engines died. Convoys stretched for miles, burning fuel just to move a few kilometers. What had once been efficiency turned into exhaustion. The soldiers waiting near Pskov began to count the days between shipments instead of the hours. Supplies that once arrived daily now took weeks. Ammunition ran low. Spare parts disappeared. The Empire's proud Iron Division, the force once promised to defend the borders of the north, found itself caught between hunger and humiliation. They could neither move forward nor retreat. They were frozen in place, surrounded not by enemies, but by emptiness. To compensate, the government redirected everything it had: resources from the east, funds from the south, orders from the top. But every solution only deepened the wound. Because the railway was not just a path of transport, it was the rhythm of the Empire's pulse. Without it, everything slowed, communication failed, production collapsed, and most devastating of all, belief began to vanish. When Finland joined NATO in 2023, the North had already become a new frontier. The Empire needed the Northern Corridor more than ever, not just to feed the war in Ukraine, but to reinforce its own border with the West. Now, with the railway destroyed, both missions were impossible. The Empire found itself stretched between two fears: losing the war abroad and losing control at home. The more it tried to fight both, the faster it decayed. Further west, Kaliningrad, the Empire's isolated fortress on the Baltic, began to feel the strain. Its only land connection passed through foreign territory, fragile and exposed. The corridor from Novogorod had been its backup, its lifeline. Now that lifeline was gone, the city once called the unsinkable ship of the North became a drifting island of metal and anxiety. Economically, the damage was catastrophic. The same rail that carried tanks and fuel also carried food, grain, and civilian goods. Insurance companies refused to cover the line. Merchants abandoned it. The cost of transport soared. Shelves emptied. Prices rose. For the first time in decades, the people of Novigard began to feel what it meant to live inside the consequences of empire. Inside the halls of power, the silence grew heavier than the smoke. Ministers argued over whether to rebuild or reroute. Engineers warned that repairs would take months, maybe years. And even if rebuilt, who could guarantee it wouldn't happen again? The tracks could be replaced. The bridges could be repaired. But the fear, the knowledge that the system could be broken from within, could not be undone. What burned that night was more than metal. It was the illusion that control was everlasting. The empire could rebuild the railway, but it could not rebuild the certainty that once defined it. The people who had grown up believing their city was the fortress of the world now understood that fortresses, too, can fall not through invasion, but through truth. When the networks came back online, the first images that spread were not of the explosion itself, but of the silence that followed it. The halted trains, the deserted tracks, the soldiers staring at nothing. And in that silence, the people heard something they had not heard in years, themselves. For the first time, they began to ask questions no one had ever allowed them to ask. It was no longer about war, or politics, or territory.
It actually happened.
It was about dignity, about the price of believing in lies too long,
How could this happen
about
here?
the cost of silence mistaken for peace. The explosion had started as an act of war, but it ended as an act of awakening. In the ruins
dire
of the Northern
economic
Corridor,
consequences
a
of the
new
shattered
idea
rail
began to
system.
grow fragile, dangerous, unstoppable. The idea that a nation's strength is
supply
not
train?
measured by how much it controls, but by how much truth it can bear to face. The Empire's trains would
But
one
why are
day
we
move
still
again.
waiting?
The factories would reopen.
They said it
the
would get
officials
better.
would speak of recovery.
How can
but
we
nothing
trust
would
them
ever
now?
return to what it was. Because once a
must
people
look
have
to the
seen the
future
cracks in
now.
their own walls, they can no
We will
longer
find
pretend
the
the
truth
fortress
in the
is whole.
ruins of our
In every
past.
age, power begins with belief and ends when belief is lost. The story of Novigard is not just about a railway, a regime, or a fallen empire. It is about the moment a society realizes that silence is not safety, and obedience is not peace. The explosion that shattered the Northern Corridor was not merely a military defeat. It was the sound of truth breaking through years of controlled noise. For too long, people were taught that loyalty meant blindness, that patriotism meant silence, that strength meant never questioning. But when the lights went out and the trains stopped running, they discovered something far more powerful than any weapon the courage to see. Because a nation is not made of steel or slogans. It is made of hearts that still know how to feel, and minds that dare to think for themselves. If there is one message left from Novigard's ashes, it is this: no system built on fear can outlast those who remember how to hope. Empires fall not when their enemies attack, but when their people awaken. If this story moved you, let it remind you of your own power, the power to question, to feel, to choose truth over comfort. Don't forget to share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire, and let's keep this conversation alive. Because somewhere, even now, another empire of silence is waiting to fall, and the world will need witnesses who still remember what freedom sounds like.